What if the official story of your hometown is missing something? Not a small detail, not a minor gap in the record, something larger, something that has been sitting in plain sight for a very long time, on the streets you walk every day, in the buildings you pass without looking at closely, in the ground beneath the sidewalks you have crossed hundreds of times without thinking twice. Most people never ask this question. There's no obvious reason to. The town has a name, a founding date, a local museum with photographs and documents, and a general sense of history that feels settled. But settled and complete are two different things. And in a surprising number of places across the country, the settled version of local history turns out to have gaps that are difficult to explain once you start looking at the physical evidence carefully. This particular question started with old photographs, not dramatic discoveries or unusual sources, just black and white images from a local history archive, the kind of photographs that sit in folders in library basements, available to anyone who asks, looked at rarely, and almost never examined with any real attention. These were images of downtown streets from the late 1800s, standard historical material, the sort used in anniversary publications and local history displays. But something in those photographs did not match what exists in person today. The buildings were recognizable. Same stonework, same facades, same general construction, same addresses. Nothing about the structures themselves suggested any major difference between then and now, except for one detail that became impossible to ignore once it was noticed. In the photographs, there were windows and doors at a level that today sits completely underground, not on the first floor as it currently exists, not in a basement added later, at what was clearly, in those images, the original ground floor. Street-level entrances, first-floor windows opening directly onto the sidewalk, storefronts at the base of buildings, where people would have walked in from the street without any steps, without any descent. Today, that level is buried, not demolished, not removed, not renovated out of existence, buried, as if several feet of earth had been placed over the original street surface, and the city simply continued building on top of the new level without ever fully addressing what was underneath. The old ground floor did not disappear. It went down, and in many cases it is still there, sealed beneath the current sidewalk, with its windows now facing nothing but compacted earth and forgotten space. At first, this seemed like it might be specific to one building, an unusual case, perhaps a structure built at an odd elevation that was later corrected when the surrounding street was improved. That explanation held for approximately as long as it took to check the next block, where the same thing appeared. Windows at the same buried level, the same relationship between the current street surface and what the photographs showed as the original ground floor. Then the next street showed the same thing, and the street after that, not in every building, not with perfect uniformity, but consistently enough across the older sections of the city that a pattern became visible. Something had happened to the street level across a wide area, not in one location, across an entire district, possibly more. But this is where it becomes unclear, because when the same search was extended to other cities, the pattern did not stop at the city limits. Other places showed the same buried ground floors, same depth roughly, same type of evidence. Old photographs showing street-level windows and entrances that today sit underground. Different cities, different regions, different local histories, but the same basic physical result. This raises an immediate and straightforward question. If these ground floors are buried, when did that happen? The photographs themselves are from the late 1800s, which means the original street level was already different even then. The burial, in at least some of these places, appears to have occurred before the period when these cities were considered fully established, before the era when detailed construction records would have captured such a significant change, which makes it difficult to trace through standard historical documentation. And then a second question follows from the first, and this one is harder to set aside. Why does the same burial depth appear in cities that are separated by hundreds of miles, sometimes thousands of miles? Cities with completely different founding histories, different climates, different soil conditions, different development timelines. If each city raised its street level for its own local reasons, the results should vary. The depth should differ. The method should differ. The timing should differ. But in many cases, They don't differ as much as the separate local explanations would predict. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because consistent results across unconnected locations usually indicate a shared cause. In engineering, in geology, in any field where patterns appear across different sites, the first question researchers ask is whether something common is producing the common result. The local explanations for street raising are local, but the pattern they are supposed to explain is not local. It is widespread, and widespread patterns with local explanations leave a gap in the reasoning that is worth paying attention to. There are also smaller details within this broader pattern that add to the difficulty. In some of the cities where buried ground floors have been documented, the historical record of when the street level was raised is incomplete or unclear. Chicago has well-documented records of its raising projects in the 1850s and 1860s, but other cities, with the same physical evidence, have much thinner documentation of when or how their street levels changed. The buildings show the evidence. The records sometimes do not fully explain it. It doesn't fully make sense that a change significant enough to bury entire ground floors across wide urban areas would leave behind unclear or missing documentation in multiple locations. Raising a street level is not a minor project. It requires labor, materials, planning, and some form of civic decision. These are the kinds of activities that generate records. Purchase orders, contracts, municipal approvals, newspaper coverage, and yet in some cases, the records are thin, partial, or simply not there in the way you would expect. At first, it seems like this could be explained by the general incompleteness of early American record keeping. Young cities in the 1800s did not always maintain thorough archives. Documents were lost to fires, floods, poor storage, and simple neglect. That explanation is reasonable and probably accounts for some of the missing documentation, but it becomes harder to apply uniformly when the same gap appears in city after city. At some point, consistent absence of records becomes its own kind of evidence that something is not fully accounted for. This is the point where 5 specific signs begin to emerge from the broader pattern. Signs that researchers and local historians have identified appearing repeatedly across towns and cities of different sizes, in different regions, across very different official histories. Not every sign appears in every location, but they appear often enough, and in enough combinations, that they have started to be treated as a recognizable pattern rather than a series of unrelated local coincidences. The buried ground floors are the most visually immediate sign, but they are not the only one, and when they are considered alongside the others, the questions they raise become harder to explain through any single local cause. Something was happening across a wide geography during a specific period of time, something that left physical evidence in the streets, in the buildings, in the architectural details, and in the gaps where records should exist but don't. What that something was is genuinely unclear. Researchers who have looked at this question carefully do not agree on an answer. Some believe the evidence points to a period of rapid and poorly documented development, in which cities were built and rebuilt faster than records could capture. Others believe the pattern suggests something that the standard historical narrative has not fully addressed. Neither position has been conclusively established. What is established is that the physical evidence exists. The buried windows are still there in many cities, visible through sidewalk grates or accessible through underground tours, or simply present as anomalies in old building basements. The photographs that first raised this question are still in those archives, available to anyone who wants to look at them. The pattern across multiple cities is documented and verifiable, not a matter of interpretation, but of observable fact. And at least one of the signs connected to this broader pattern is almost certainly present within a reasonable distance of where you are right now, not as a dramatic discovery waiting to be made, but as something ordinary and overlooked, something that has been there the entire time, in a building you may have passed many times, on a street you know well, in a part of your town that seems completely familiar. The question is simply whether it has ever been looked at carefully enough to notice what it might suggest. Most things that have been sitting in plain sight for a long time stop being seen at all. They become part of the background, part of the settled version of the place, part of the story that feels complete because no one has recently asked whether it actually is. That is what makes this particular line of investigation unusual. It does not require access to restricted archives or specialized equipment or obscure sources. It requires looking at things that are already visible and asking whether the explanation that has always been attached to them actually accounts for what is physically there. Sometimes it does. And sometimes, when the photographs are compared to the current street level, or when the depth of a buried floor is measured, or when the documentation of a major construction project turns out to be thinner than it should be, the standard explanation starts to show its edges. And once those edges become visible, they are difficult to ignore. The buried windows keep being buried. The pattern across cities keeps being consistent. The questions that were raised by a set of old photographs in a local archive remain exactly as open as they were when they were first noticed. No fully satisfying answer has arrived, and the ground beneath the sidewalk remains exactly where it has always been, holding whatever it holds, while the city above it continues on as if the question were already settled. It may not be. When historians and engineers are asked about buried ground floors, they have a ready answer. It is not a complicated one. Cities grew, infrastructure developed, and street levels were raised to solve practical problems that came with that growth. The explanation is framed as a natural consequence of urban development, a necessary adjustment that growing cities had to make. And for many people who encounter the buried windows for the first time, this explanation is enough to close the question. The core of the official explanation rests on one word: drainage. In the early and mid-1800s, most American cities had no functional sewage systems. Waste moved through open channels or simply accumulated. Rainwater pooled in low areas. Streets in many cities were unpaved and became difficult to navigate after heavy rain. As populations grew and cities became more densely developed, these problems became serious public health concerns. The solution that engineers arrived at in city after city was to raise the street level high enough to install underground pipe systems that could carry waste and water away from populated areas. To do that, the ground had to go up. That explanation is straightforward. It is well documented in certain cases, and it is the explanation that most local history sources, municipal records, and architectural guides will offer when the subject of buried ground floors comes up. It has the quality of an answer that sounds complete. Practical problem, practical solution, verifiable in at least some locations through engineering records and contemporary accounts. Chicago is always the first example offered, and with good reason. The Chicago raising project of the 1850s and 1860s is one of the most thoroughly documented infrastructure undertakings in American urban history. The city had been built on low, swampy ground near Lake Michigan. After heavy rain, the streets turned to mud. Waste had nowhere to drain. Disease moved through the population with regularity. Engineers determined that the only viable solution was to raise the entire downtown district to an elevation that would allow proper underground drainage to function. What followed was, by any measure, an extraordinary construction effort. The streets were raised, but more than that, the buildings were raised with them. Using a system of thousands of jackscrews placed beneath building foundations, workers lifted entire structures off their original bases while occupants continued using the upper floors. Businesses stayed open. Guests slept in hotels. People moved through buildings that were, at that moment, being physically lifted off the ground. One project completed in 1860 raised a full city block of interconnected buildings with a combined weight of approximately 35,000 tons. The process took 4 days. The engineering required to coordinate that lift across thousands of individual screws, keeping the structures level and stable throughout, was considered a significant achievement for its time. The result was a new street level several feet above the original. The old ground floors became basements or were sealed entirely. The original storefronts, the windows that once opened onto the street, now faced underground, and the city continued on top of the new surface as if the old one had never been the reference point. Seattle offers a different but related version of the same story. In 1889, a fire destroyed a large portion of the city's original commercial district. When the decision was made to rebuild, city planners took the opportunity to raise the street level significantly. The original district had been built on tide flats that flooded regularly, and the fire was seen as a chance to correct the elevation problem that had existed since the city's earliest days. Streets were raised by as much as 12 to 30 feet in some areas. The original storefronts were not demolished. They simply became underground. Today, portions of that original street level can still be walked through on organized tours, which makes Seattle one of the few places where the buried layer is not just visible but physically accessible. Portland presents a quieter version of the same pattern. Excavations and building renovations in the older sections of the city have repeatedly revealed original ground floors sitting 8 to 10 feet below the current street surface. The official explanation there points to a combination of factors, including gradual fill accumulation, deliberate grading projects, and post-flood elevation adjustments over several decades of development. The result is the same buried layer visible in Chicago and Seattle, reached through a different stated cause. And this is where the official explanation begins to show its structure most clearly. Each city has its own reason. Chicago raised its streets for drainage. Seattle raised its streets after fire. Portland's street level changed through a combination of gradual processes. Each explanation is local. Each one is attached to a specific event or condition unique to that place. And taken individually, each one is plausible. Drainage is a real engineering problem. Fire recovery is a real historical event. Gradual fill accumulation is a real process. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the physical result across all of these cities is not individual. It is consistent. The same buried depth. The same relationship between old photographs and current street level. The same sealed ground floors. The same windows facing underground. If the causes are all different and all local, why is the result so similar across locations that had nothing to do with each other? That question does not invalidate the official explanation. It complicates it. There is a difference between saying the explanation is wrong and saying the explanation does not fully account for the pattern. The local explanations may all be accurate as far as they go. Chicago may have genuinely needed to raise its streets for drainage. Seattle may have genuinely used the fire as an opportunity to correct its elevation. But accurate local explanations for local events do not automatically explain why those local events produced the same physical signature across cities that were not connected to each other's development decisions. At first, it seems normal that different cities would arrive at similar solutions to similar problems. Cities in the same era shared engineering knowledge. Pattern books and engineering guides circulated widely. Infrastructure solutions developed in one city were studied and applied in others. So it is not unreasonable to suggest that raising street levels became a standard approach that many cities adopted independently, but for consistent reasons. However, the timeline does not fully match that explanation in every case. The Chicago raising project is well documented with specific dates, engineering records, and contemporary newspaper coverage. But when you look at other cities showing the same buried ground floors, the documentation is not always as clear. Some cities with visible evidence of raised street levels have partial records of when the change happened. Some have very little documentation at all. The physical evidence says the street level changed. The written record of why and when is sometimes thinner than you would expect for a project of that scale. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. A project large enough to bury an entire district's ground floors is not a small undertaking. It requires labor, materials, planning, equipment, and civic authorization. These are activities that generate paperwork, contracts, cost estimates, council approvals, engineering surveys. In Chicago, that paperwork exists and is detailed. In other cities with the same physical result, the paperwork trail sometimes ends before it should. Not always, not in every case, but often enough that the inconsistency is noticeable once you start comparing locations. Some researchers point to this documentation gap as evidence of nothing more than the ordinary record-keeping failures of the 1800s. Archives were poorly maintained. Fires destroyed municipal records in many cities. The sheer pace of development in rapidly growing American towns meant that not everything was written down or preserved. That explanation is reasonable and probably accounts for a significant portion of the missing documentation. It doesn't fully make sense to assume intentional concealment when ordinary loss of records is a well-established historical reality. Others point out that the same physical result appearing with thin documentation in multiple separate locations is a pattern that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Not because the official explanation is necessarily false, but because a consistent physical pattern with inconsistent documentation raises a question that the documentation itself cannot answer. If the records are incomplete, how confident can we be that the explanation attached to the physical evidence is the complete one? And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the official account of raised street levels rests heavily on the Chicago case, which is well documented, and then extends that framework to other cities, where the documentation is less thorough. Chicago proves the concept. The concept is then applied to explain similar evidence elsewhere. But applying a proven explanation from one well-documented case to multiple less documented cases is not the same as proving the explanation in each individual case. It is an assumption of similarity. A reasonable one, perhaps, but still an assumption. There is also a geographic dimension to this that the local explanations do not fully address. The pattern of buried ground floors is not limited to American cities. The same evidence appears in cities in other countries, in regions with entirely different development histories, in places where the American infrastructure context does not apply. St. Petersburg shows it. Parts of older European cities show it. Cities that were not building sewage systems in the 1850s under the influence of American engineering guides show similar buried layers at similar depths. The local explanation works locally, but the pattern is not local. What the official explanation offers is a framework that is internally consistent and supported by evidence in at least some cases. It is not fabricated. It is not entirely without support. Chicago really did raise its streets. Seattle really did bury its original storefronts. Those facts are solid. The question that remains is whether those facts fully explain the broader pattern, or whether the broader pattern includes something that the local explanations, accurate as they may be in their own contexts, were never designed to address. That question sits at the edge of the official explanation, not inside it, and it is a question that the explanation, as currently constructed, does not answer. The buried windows remain. The consistent depth remains. The cities separated by oceans with the same sealed ground floors remain, and the local explanations, each one attached to its own specific cause, continue to account for their individual cases without fully accounting for the pattern they are all part of. Something produced that pattern, whether the official explanation covers it entirely, or only partially, or leaves something genuinely unaddressed, is not yet settled, and that uncertainty is not a small one. It lives in the ground beneath the sidewalk of every city where those old windows are still there, still facing downward, still waiting for an explanation that accounts for all of them at once rather than each one separately. The official explanation holds up reasonably well when you look at each city individually. Chicago needed drainage. Seattle recovered from fire. Portland adjusted for flooding. Each case has its own context, its own engineering logic, its own documented reasons for why the street level changed. And when you read about any single one of these cities in isolation, the explanation feels complete. It answers the question that was asked. It closes the gap between the buried evidence and the historical record. But the problem with evaluating explanations individually is that it prevents you from seeing what only becomes visible when you look at all of them together. When you step back and look at the full picture, something shifts. The individual explanations are still there. They have not changed. But something else becomes visible alongside them. A consistency that the individual explanations do not account for. Because the result across all of these cities is not varied the way the causes are varied. The causes are different. Drainage in one place. Fire recovery in another. Flood adjustment somewhere else. But the physical outcome is remarkably similar. The same buried depth. The same sealed ground floors. The same windows facing underground. The same relationship between old photographs and current street level, repeated across cities that had entirely different reasons for arriving at the same place. This raises questions, not about whether the individual explanations are accurate. They may well be, but about whether accurate individual explanations are sufficient to account for a consistent collective result. In most fields of investigation, when different causes produce identical outcomes across unconnected locations, researchers look for a shared factor, something present in all the cases that the individual explanations do not capture. The local explanations describe what happened in each city. They do not fully explain why the result looks the same everywhere. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the pattern does not stop at the borders of American cities. It does not stay within the geography where American engineering influence was strongest or where 19th century infrastructure development was most concentrated. The same buried ground floors, the same sealed windows at the same general depth, appear in cities on entirely different continents. Cities that were not connected to American urban development trends. Cities that did not share Chicago's drainage problem or Seattle's fire history or Portland's flooding concern. St. Petersburg is one of the most frequently referenced examples outside of North America. The city shows the same pattern. Original ground floors sitting below current street level. Windows that once opened onto street-facing surfaces now buried. The same general depth of burial that appears in American cities. But St. Petersburg's development history is entirely separate. Different government, different climate, different engineering traditions, different historical pressures. The infrastructure problems that drove Chicago to raise its streets were not the infrastructure problems facing a Russian imperial city built on a different geography with a different administrative structure. It doesn't fully make sense that two cities with different problems in different countries, with different engineering traditions, would arrive at the same physical result by coincidence. Coincidence is a reasonable explanation for isolated similarities. It becomes harder to apply when the similarity is specific, measurable, and repeated across a wide geographic range. The burial depth is not a vague resemblance. It is a consistent physical measurement that appears in location after location, separated by distances that make direct influence between them unlikely as a complete explanation. Some researchers respond to this by pointing to the global spread of engineering knowledge in the 19th century. Techniques developed in one country moved to others through published works, traveling engineers, and international exhibitions. Infrastructure solutions that proved effective in American cities were studied by engineers in Europe and elsewhere. It is possible, in this view, that raising street levels became a broadly adopted approach across different countries for broadly similar reasons, even if the specific local triggers differed. That explanation has some merit. It accounts for the spread of technique without requiring a single shared cause. However, the timeline does not fully match that explanation in every case. If street raising spread as an adopted technique from well-documented cases like Chicago to other cities, the documentation trail should reflect that adoption. You would expect to find references to Chicago's methods in the engineering records of cities that followed a similar approach. You would expect the timing to reflect a logical sequence, with Chicago and other early cases influencing later ones. In some cases, that sequence is traceable. In others, it is not. And in some cities outside of North America, where the buried ground floors appear, the connection to American engineering influence is unclear or undocumented. At first, it seems normal that different cities would independently develop similar solutions. Practical problems often produce similar practical answers, even without direct contact between the people solving them. That is a well-established pattern in the history of technology and engineering. But there is a difference between similar solutions and identical results. And the consistency of the burial depth across locations is specific enough that the independent development explanation requires some examination before it is accepted as complete. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because depth is not a vague similarity. If cities were raising their streets for different reasons, the depth of raising should vary with the problem being solved. A city raising its streets to install drainage pipes needs to go high enough to allow those pipes to function with gravity. A city raising its streets after a fire has different practical constraints. A city adjusting for periodic flooding has different requirements still. Different problems, with different engineering parameters, should produce different depths of street raising. And yet the depth of burial visible in the old photographs and in excavated ground floors is consistent enough across different locations that the variation you would expect from different causes is not fully present. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Because if the depth is consistent and the causes are varied, something is either controlling the depth independently of the local cause, or the local causes are not the primary driver of the result. Neither of those possibilities is fully explained by the standard framework. They are questions that sit outside the boundary of what the local explanations were designed to address. There's also a quieter inconsistency that does not get discussed as often, but is perhaps the most direct challenge to the official timeline. The photographs. The old black and white images that first brought the buried ground floors to attention are themselves from the late 1800s. Most of them date from the 1870s through the 1890s. And in those photographs, the buildings are already showing the buried condition. The ground floors that are currently underground are already lower than the street level visible in those images, which means the change had already happened by the time those photographs were taken. This raises a specific timeline problem. If the street raising in cities like Chicago is documented as occurring in the 1850s and 1860s, and the photographs from the 1870s and 1880s already show the buried result, then the timeline is at least internally consistent for Chicago. The documented raising preceded the photographic evidence of burial. But in other cities where the documentation of street raising is thinner or unclear, the photographs still show buildings already in the buried condition during the same period, which suggests the change happened in those cities at roughly the same time, even when the documented raising projects are not as clearly recorded. And if the change happened across multiple cities in roughly the same period, with or without clear documentation of the raising process, then the question of timing becomes more pressing. A coordinated or simultaneous change across multiple cities would require either a coordinated cause or a pre-existing condition that was already in place before the cities developed fully. The photographs don't show the raising happening. They show the result already present. And in some cases, the raising process itself is not captured in the historical record with the clarity you would expect. If the streets were raised during the active development of these cities, the documentary record of that period should include the raising. Newspapers covered major construction projects. City councils debated infrastructure spending. Engineers filed reports. The Chicago raising is visible in all of these sources because it happened during a period of active documentation. But other cities, with the same physical evidence, do not always have the same documentary trail. The photographs show the result. The record of how the result was achieved is sometimes much thinner than the scale of the project would predict. Some believe this is simply a reflection of uneven record keeping across different cities and different periods. Not every municipality maintained thorough archives in the mid-1800s. Fires destroyed records in many places. The simple passage of time degraded documents that were never stored carefully. These are real factors, and they account for genuine gaps in the historical record across many topics. Not just this one. Others disagree that ordinary record loss fully explains the pattern. They point out that the gap is consistent enough and appears in enough separate locations that something beyond random archive loss seems to be at work. The distinction between those two positions is not a small one. If the gaps are the result of ordinary record loss, then the official explanation is essentially complete, and the missing documentation is simply missing, not informative. If the gaps are not fully explained by ordinary loss, then the documentation itself becomes part of the pattern that needs explaining. And a pattern of missing documentation for a specific type of large-scale physical change, appearing across multiple cities in a specific time period, is a different kind of problem than scattered archive loss. What the photographs reveal, quietly and without interpretation, is that the buried condition was already in place during the era when these cities were being actively documented in other ways. The same era that produced detailed newspaper coverage of politics, commerce, crime, and culture somehow produced thinner records of major infrastructure changes in multiple locations. That is not impossible, but it is worth noting, and it sits alongside the global consistency of the burial pattern as something that the local explanations, accurate as they may be in their individual cases, do not fully resolve. The result is a set of questions that remain open, not because the official explanation has been disproven. It has not, but because the explanation as it currently stands accounts for the individual cases without fully accounting for the collective pattern. And the collective pattern, the consistent depth, the global spread, the already buried condition visible in late 19th century photographs, and the uneven documentation of the raising process itself, continues to sit in the historical record without a complete answer attached to it. The buried windows are still there. The photographs are still in the archives. And the gap between the individual explanations and the global pattern is still exactly as wide as it was when someone first noticed that the same result was appearing in cities that had no obvious reason to share one. The first sign involved the ground. Buried floors, sealed windows, street levels that shifted without complete explanation. That pattern raises questions on its own. But there is a second sign, and it sits directly on top of the first one in many of the same cities. It involves fire, and once the full scope of it becomes visible, it is difficult to look at the 1800s the same way again. Fire was a common reality in 19th century American cities. Buildings were made of wood. Heating systems were open flame. Water supply was limited. Fire departments were understaffed and under-equipped. Everyone who studies this period acknowledges that urban fires were frequent and destructive. That context is real and it matters. It means that the presence of fires during this era is not, by itself, unusual or suspicious. Fires happened. They were expected. They were part of the risk of living in a rapidly developing city built largely from timber. But the fires being discussed here are not ordinary urban fires. They are not the kind that destroyed a block or gutted a warehouse district. The fires that appear in this pattern consumed entire cities. Multiple districts in a single event. Thousands of structures in a matter of hours. And they appeared not occasionally, but with a regularity across this specific time period that is difficult to account for through the standard explanations of dry conditions and combustible building materials alone. The list of these events is long enough that reading through it produces a different kind of response than reading about individual disasters. Portland, Maine, in 1866 lost approximately 1,500 buildings. Chicago in 1871 lost over 17,000 structures across 3.5 square miles of the city. Boston in 1872 saw nearly 800 buildings consumed. Seattle in 1889 had 25 city blocks erased. Jacksonville, Florida in 1901 lost around 1,700 buildings in a single afternoon. Baltimore in 1904 had approximately 2,300 structures destroyed. These are not the same event described multiple times. These are separate fires, in separate cities, in separate years, each one producing destruction at a scale that would be considered a major national disaster in any era. And this is where it becomes unclear, because during the 1850s alone, before the most famous of these fires occurred, American cities were experiencing more than one significant fire per month on average. That is not a figure from a fringe source. It is reflected in the insurance records, newspaper archives, and municipal reports of the period. The frequency was high enough that fire insurance became one of the most significant financial industries of the era. Companies formed specifically to manage the risk. Actuarial tables were built around the expectation that fires of serious scale would continue occurring regularly. At first, it seems normal to attribute this to the building conditions of the time. Wood frame construction, open flames for heat and light, limited firefighting capacity. These are genuine risk factors, and they genuinely contributed to fire spread once a fire began. But the scale of the fires being described here goes beyond what those risk factors alone would predict. There's a difference between conditions that make fires likely and conditions that produce simultaneous destruction of thousands of structures across miles of urban area. The risk factors explain ignition and spread. They do not fully explain the scale. This raises questions about what exactly was burning and how. Contemporary accounts of some of these fires describe behavior that does not match ordinary urban fire spread. Some survivors described fires that moved in ways inconsistent with wind direction. Some accounts mention structures that burned from the inside out or from the ground up in patterns that observers found unusual. These accounts exist in the historical record, in newspaper archives and personal letters from the period, and they are not always easily reconciled with the standard explanation of wind-driven fires spreading through combustible building stock. Some researchers treat these accounts as the natural confusion of witnesses experiencing traumatic events. People in crisis do not always observe accurately. Memory is unreliable under extreme stress. Fire behavior is complex and can appear counterintuitive to untrained observers. These are reasonable qualifications. They explain why individual witness accounts should not be taken as definitive evidence of unusual fire behavior. But they do not explain why similar observational anomalies appear in accounts from different fires in different cities in different years. If the unusual descriptions were confined to one event, witness confusion would be the most reasonable explanation. When similar descriptions appear across multiple events, the pattern deserves more careful examination. However, the most consistent and observable feature of the fire pattern is not in the witness accounts. It is in what came after. Cities rebuilt. That is expected. What is less expected, and what draws the attention of researchers who have studied this period carefully, is how they rebuilt. The replacement structures were different from what they replaced. Not just in material, which shifted from wood to brick and stone in many cases for understandable fire prevention reasons. Different in design, different in complexity, different in the level of architectural detail they contained. The buildings that existed before these fires, as documented in early photographs, insurance surveys, and architectural records where those records survive, included structures of significant sophistication. Ornate facades, detailed stonework, proportioned columns, architectural elements that required skilled craftsmanship to produce. The buildings that replaced them after the fires were, in many cases, simpler, more functional, less detailed, built to serve the same purposes, but without the same architectural ambition that characterized what they replaced. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the standard expectation after a disaster is that rebuilding restores what was lost or improves on it. Resources permitting, communities rebuild to at least the standard they had before. In many cases after major disasters, the rebuilt version is more advanced than the original because new materials and techniques are available. But in city after city that experienced these fires, the rebuilt version was architecturally simpler than what the records suggest existed before. Not more advanced, simpler, plainer, less ornamented. This doesn't fully make sense within the standard framework of disaster recovery. If a city had the sophistication to produce elaborately detailed architecture before a fire, the knowledge and skill required to produce that architecture did not disappear in the fire. Craftsmen, architects, and builders who knew how to create detailed stonework and proportioned facades would still exist after the fire. They would rebuild to the standard they knew, unless the standard they knew was not actually the standard they had originally built to. Unless the buildings that burned were not built by the same community that rebuilt after them. Some believe this distinction is meaningful, that the gap between pre-fire and post-fire architectural quality reflects a genuine discontinuity, that the communities rebuilding after these fires were not restoring their own prior work, but replacing structures they had inherited rather than built, with structures they actually knew how to construct from their own knowledge and resources. Others disagree. They point to economic factors, changes in architectural fashion, the practical pressures of rapid rebuilding under financial strain, and the shift in available materials as sufficient explanation for the simpler character of the rebuilt structures. Both positions exist in the historical and architectural literature, and neither has been definitively resolved. But the timeline of the fires themselves adds another layer to the question. The fires were concentrated in a specific window, the second half of the 1800s, with particular density between 1850 and 1910. Before that window, the architectural record of many of these cities, limited as it is, suggests structures of considerable sophistication. After that window, the architectural character of American cities settled into something more consistent with what we would expect from the documented labor force, materials, and construction knowledge of the period. The fires sit directly in the middle of the transition, and they are concentrated enough in time that the transition from sophisticated to simpler architecture and the fire window are difficult to fully separate. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because a pattern of fires concentrated in one historical period followed consistently by architectural simplification in the rebuilt structures across multiple unconnected cities, is the kind of pattern that invites a question about cause, not the cause of each individual fire, which the historical record addresses with varying degrees of completeness, but the cause of the pattern itself. Why this period? Why this concentration? Why this consistent result in the rebuilt environments? The standard explanation points to the convergence of several factors. Rapid urbanization created dense, combustible environments. The Industrial Revolution introduced new ignition sources. Firefighting technology lagged behind the pace of urban growth. Economic booms led to fast, cheap construction that was more vulnerable to fire spread. These are all real factors, and they all contributed to the elevated fire frequency of the period. They explain why the era was prone to destructive fires. They do not fully explain why the result of those fires was so consistent across so many different cities, or why the post-fire architecture settled into a simpler register than what preceded it. There are also specific cases within the fire record that sit outside what the standard explanation comfortably addresses. The simultaneous or near-simultaneous nature of some of these events, the geographic spread of damage within individual fires that sometimes exceeded what wind conditions at the time would predict, the survival patterns within burned areas, where some structures remained standing in ways that contemporary firefighters and engineers found difficult to explain through ordinary fire behavior. These are details present in the historical record, in insurance investigations, engineering reports, and contemporary journalism. They are not invented. They are simply not always accounted for in the summary explanations that history eventually settled on. What the fire pattern leaves behind is a question that sits between the documented facts. The fires were real. The destruction was real. The rebuilding was real. The documentation of all of this is extensive enough that the basic outline is not in doubt. What remains less clear is whether the fires were simply the natural consequence of the conditions that existed, or whether those conditions were sufficient to produce the specific pattern that actually occurred. The frequency, the scale, the geographic spread, the concentrated time window, and the consistent post-fire simplification of architecture are all facts. Whether they add up to something beyond an unlucky era of urban fire risk is a question that has not been fully answered. The rebuilt cities are still there. The pre-fire photographs, where they exist, are still in the archives. And the difference between what those photographs show and what stands on the same streets today is still visible to anyone who looks at both carefully. Something changed during that 50-year window. The fires are part of the explanation. Whether they are all of it remains genuinely unclear. Within the broader pattern of 19th century fires, most individual events can be examined separately and explained through the conditions that existed at the time. Dry seasons, dense wooden construction, limited water supply, slow emergency response. These factors combine differently in different cities and produce different fires with different characteristics. That variability is part of what makes the individual explanations plausible. Each fire has its own context, its own specific chain of events, its own local conditions that account for how it started and how far it spread. When fires behave differently from each other, the individual explanations hold their shape reasonably well. But there is one date in this period that does not behave like the others. One night where the individual explanation framework stops working cleanly, and something more difficult to account for becomes visible. That date is October 8, 1871, and what happened on that night across the American Midwest is still, in certain specific respects, not fully explained by the historical record. Most people who know anything about this date know it because of the Great Chicago Fire. That event is well documented, widely covered in historical literature, and has its own established place in American history. The fire began on the evening of October 8th, spread rapidly through the city's wooden structures, and by the time it was contained 2 days later, had destroyed over 17,000 buildings across more than 3 square miles of urban area. Approximately 300 people died. Around 100,000 were left without shelter. The scale of the destruction was significant enough that Chicago's recovery and rebuilding became a reference point in American urban history. The fire itself has been studied extensively. Its causes, its spread, its aftermath are all documented in considerable detail. But the Great Chicago Fire was not the only fire that began on the night of October 8, 1871. And this is where the date becomes something more than a single historical event. On the same evening, in the state of Wisconsin, the Peshtigo Fire ignited. It is not as well known as the Chicago Fire, partly because Chicago's urban destruction was more immediately visible, and partly because the Peshtigo event occurred in a rural and forested region that received less national press attention at the time. But in terms of raw scale, the Peshtigo Fire is the most destructive wildfire in recorded American history. It consumed somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 million acres of forest and agricultural land. The death toll estimates range from 1,200 to 2,500 people, with the uncertainty itself reflecting how thoroughly the fire eliminated entire communities, along with their records and their residents. And on that same night, in the state of Michigan, a third significant fire event was underway. The Great Michigan Fire, sometimes called the Lower Michigan Fire, moved through the western and eastern regions of the state, causing serious destruction in the cities of Holland, Manistee, and Port Huron, among others. 3 separate fire events. 3 different states, all beginning on the same night. 3 states. Nearly 3,900 square miles of total affected area. One night. That combination of facts is what makes October 8, 1871 sit differently than the other fires in this period. Individual large fires can be explained through local conditions. Simultaneous large fires across 3 states require either a remarkable coincidence of local conditions or something that connected the separate ignition events. The official explanation points to the first possibility. Extremely dry conditions across the Great Lakes region, combined with high winds, created an environment where existing land-clearing fires, which were common practice in the agricultural expansion of the era, could escape control and grow rapidly into major events. At first, it seems normal that a regional drought combined with high winds could produce multiple serious fires in the same general time frame. Fire weather does not respect state lines. A dry autumn across a wide geographic area creates elevated risk across that entire area simultaneously. If multiple small fires were already burning as part of land-clearing operations, a sudden wind event could fan several of them into larger fires at roughly the same time. That sequence is meteorologically plausible and is the foundation of the official explanation. However, the timeline does not fully match that explanation when the Peshtigo accounts are examined carefully. The Peshtigo Fire did not behave like a land-clearing fire that grew out of control in dry conditions. The accounts of survivors, collected in the days and weeks after the event by journalists, clergy, and local officials, describe something that moved and behaved differently from what those conditions would predict. Winds were estimated at over 110 miles per hour within the fire zone. Temperatures reached levels that some observers estimated above 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to melt metal objects and reduce structures to ash almost instantly. The fire moved faster than people could run from it, which is itself unusual for a ground-level fire spreading through forest and farmland. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the specific details reported by Peshtigo survivors go beyond the characteristics of an extreme but ordinary wildfire. People described blue flames appearing at ground level, separate from the main fire front. Trees in some areas were stripped completely bare of bark and branches, but left standing, not burned to the ground as would be expected. The standing trees were bent away from the fire's apparent center, as if pushed by a force moving outward rather than the wind moving inward toward the fire, as would be typical with a large blaze, creating its own inward draft. These are details recorded in the historical accounts. They are not modern interpretations applied retroactively. They were observed and reported by people who were present. The official explanation does not directly address these specific observations. The general framework of extreme fire behavior under severe weather conditions can account for some unusual characteristics. Firestorms, which are large fires that generate their own weather systems, including powerful inward winds, are a documented phenomenon. They can produce extreme temperatures and rapid spread. Some of the Peshtigo accounts are consistent with firestorm behavior, but not all of the specific details sit comfortably within that framework. The blue ground flames, the specific pattern of tree damage, the outward rather than inward displacement of vegetation near the fire center. These remain in the historical record without a fully satisfying explanation attached to them. This raises questions that have not been fully resolved. Questions that were first raised not in recent times, but beginning in 1883, when a researcher named Ignatius Donnelly published a work examining catastrophic events in history and suggested that the simultaneous fires of October 8th might have a common cause that the official explanation did not account for. His specific proposal, that fragmented debris from a comet passing near Earth had entered the atmosphere above the Great Lakes region and produced ignition events across a wide area simultaneously, was not accepted by the scientific establishment of his time. It has not been accepted since, but the question he attached to the simultaneous ignition did not disappear with the rejection of his specific theory. The comet debris hypothesis was examined again in 1985 by researchers looking at the October 1871 events through a more modern scientific lens. It was revisited in a 1997 documentary and examined in a 2004 paper submitted to the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. The hypothesis in its modern form suggests that Earth passed through the debris field of Biela's comet, a comet that had been observed to split into two fragments in 1846 and was never seen again after 1852. The timing of the debris field passage would have placed fragmented material in the upper atmosphere above the Great Lakes region in early October 1871. Whether that material could have produced ground-level ignition events is a question that the papers examining the hypothesis treat as scientifically plausible but unconfirmed. Some believe the comet debris explanation accounts for details that the standard explanation cannot. The simultaneous ignition across hundreds of miles, the unusual fire behavior reported at Peshtigo, the specific geographic concentration of the events in a region that would correspond to a debris field passage on a particular atmospheric trajectory. Others disagree. They point out that the comet debris hypothesis requires a chain of physical events that has not been directly observed or replicated, and that the standard explanation of extreme fire weather across a regionally dry autumn is sufficient to account for the simultaneous timing without invoking an extraterrestrial cause. The scientific mainstream remains with the standard explanation, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because both positions acknowledge the same set of facts. The fires happened simultaneously. The scale was extraordinary. The Peshtigo accounts include details that are unusual. The disagreement is about what those facts require as an explanation. The standard framework says regional weather conditions are sufficient. The alternative hypothesis says the specific details of the events require something the weather explanation does not provide. Neither side has produced evidence that fully closes the question. That detail sounds minor at first, the gap between an accepted explanation and an unresolved set of specific observations, until it is examined more closely, because the gap has persisted not for a few years, but for over 150 years. The Peshtigo accounts have been available to historians and scientists throughout that entire period. The unusual details they contain have been acknowledged, not invented or discovered recently. And yet no explanation has been produced that accounts for all of them within a single coherent framework. The standard explanation accounts for most of what happened. The specific anomalies in the Peshtigo accounts remain outside its boundaries. What makes this more than an isolated historical puzzle is its connection to the broader fire pattern of the period. October 8th, 1871 is the most concentrated example of simultaneous large-scale fire events, but it exists within a 50-year window of fire activity across American cities and regions that is itself unusual in its frequency and scale. The question of whether that window reflects ordinary risk factors operating at the high end of their range, or something additional that the standard explanations do not capture, is the same question that applies to the individual fires and to the single night of October 8th. The specific anomalies of that night make the broader question harder to set aside. However, it is important to be clear about what is and is not established. The fires of October 8th, 1871, are historical fact. The destruction they caused is documented. The death tolls, the geographic extent, the timing, these are not in dispute. What is in dispute is the cause of their simultaneity and the explanation for the specific behavioral characteristics reported at Peshtigo. Those questions have been examined multiple times over more than a century. A fully satisfying answer has not emerged. The Peshtigo accounts are still in the archives. The records of the Michigan fires are still accessible. The Chicago documentation is extensive, and October 8, 1871 remains the clearest single point in the broader fire pattern where the standard explanation and the observable record do not fully align. Not because the explanation is necessarily wrong, but because it does not account for everything that was observed and recorded on that night and in the days that followed. That gap between the explanation and the record is still there. It has not been filled, and the accounts of what people saw on that night in Wisconsin, collected by ordinary reporters and local officials doing their jobs in the aftermath of an enormous disaster, remain exactly as they were written: specific, unusual, and not fully explained by anything the historical or scientific record has produced in the century and a half since they were set down. The buried ground floors raised questions about the ground beneath these cities. The fires raised questions about what happened to what stood above that ground. And now a third sign appears. This one does not require looking down at buried windows or searching through fire records. It is visible at eye level on almost any older downtown street in the country. It has been visible the entire time. Most people simply do not think to ask the question that makes it interesting. Walk through the older section of almost any American city established before 1890. Find the courthouse. Find the old bank building on the main corner. Find the municipal hall or the post office or the federal building that has been sitting on the same block for over a century. Stand in front of it and look at it, not casually, the way you pass a familiar building without registering its details. Look at it carefully. Look at the stonework. Look at the columns if there are columns. Look at the carved details on the facade. Look at the proportions of the structure as a whole, the relationship between its height and width, the spacing of its windows, the way its elements relate to each other across the full face of the building. What you are looking at required an extraordinary level of skill to produce. Not skilled in the general sense that all construction requires competence. Skilled in a specific, technical, and difficult-to-acquire sense. The kind of skill that takes years to develop, that is passed from experienced craftsmen to apprentices over long periods of training, that depends on accumulated knowledge about materials, tools, and techniques that cannot be learned quickly or easily. The stonework on these buildings, the precision of the carved elements, the mathematical consistency of the proportions, these are not the products of general construction labor. They are the products of highly specialized craft knowledge applied at a level that is genuinely difficult to achieve. This raises a question that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it. Who physically built these buildings? Not which architect drew the plans. Not which firm received the commission. Who were the workers who stood in front of these stones and carved them to these tolerances? Who were the masons who laid these courses with this level of precision? What labor force, in a frontier settlement that in many cases barely had paved streets at the time of construction, was capable of producing work of this quality? The standard explanation begins with architectural pattern books. In the mid-1800s, designers and architects circulated printed catalogs showing building designs that local builders could reference and replicate. Figures like Menard Lefevre produced influential publications that spread the visual vocabulary of Greek Revival and other classical styles across the country. These books were widely used. Their influence on the appearance of American architecture in this period is documented and real. The pattern books exist. They are preserved in libraries and archives, and their role in shaping the aesthetic direction of mid-19th century American building is not in serious dispute. But this is where it becomes unclear, because a pattern book and a physical building are two entirely different things. A pattern book shows you what something should look like when it is finished. It shows proportions, shapes, decorative elements, overall compositions. What it does not show is how to achieve the physical result in stone. It does not teach a laborer how to hold a chisel at the correct angle to produce a clean acanthus leaf in limestone. It does not explain how to maintain consistent tolerance across a long run of decorative molding carved by multiple workers at different times. It does not transfer the muscle memory and material knowledge that separates a craftsman who can produce this work from a general construction worker who can read a picture of what it should look like. The gap between knowing what something should look like and knowing how to make it is not a small gap. It is a skills gap that historically has been bridged by training systems, apprenticeships, guild structures, long periods of supervised practice under experienced masters. These training systems produce craftsmen capable of high-quality stone work, but they do so slowly. They require generations of accumulated practice within a community of craft. A frontier settlement that had existed for a decade or two did not have that history. It did not have the generational depth of craft training that the quality of these buildings implies. At first, it seems normal to assume that skilled craftsmen emigrated from Europe, where those training traditions did exist, and brought their skills with them to American cities. European immigration brought enormous amounts of human knowledge and capability to America in the 19th century. Skilled stonemasons, carpenters, and craftsmen of all kinds were part of that movement. This explanation is used frequently to account for the quality of mid-19th century American construction, and it is not without basis. Skilled immigrants did contribute to American building in this period. However, the timeline does not fully match that explanation when the buildings are examined against the settlement histories of the towns that contain them. Some of the most sophisticated examples of this architecture appear in towns that were, at the time of construction, extremely small and recently established. Towns in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and across the South that had populations in the hundreds or low thousands when their courthouses and civic buildings were constructed. The idea that these small, recently founded communities had access to sufficient numbers of highly skilled European stonemasons to produce the volume and quality of work visible in their public buildings requires some examination. The scale of skilled labor implied by the buildings does not always match the documented population and economic capacity of the towns that supposedly commissioned them. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the documentation problem compounds the labor question. When researchers and local historians look for the construction records of these buildings, they frequently find very little. Payroll documents that would show who the workers were and what they were paid are often absent. Material invoices that would show where the stone came from and how it was transported are missing. Labor contracts that would name the craftsmen and specify their work are not in the archives. This is not a universal situation. Some buildings have partial records. Some have reasonably complete documentation. But the pattern of missing construction records is consistent enough across enough locations that it is difficult to attribute entirely to ordinary archive loss. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because construction at this scale generates paperwork. Large building projects in the 19th century involved significant financial transactions, contractual agreements between multiple parties, supply chains for materials, and administrative records of various kinds. When a municipality commissioned a courthouse, those decisions went through official channels that left documentary traces, budget approvals, architect contracts, site preparation records. Some of these traces survive for the buildings in question, but the specific records that would identify the skilled labor, its origin, and its compensation are often the ones that are absent. And that particular gap, in town after town, is worth noting. Some believe the missing records reflect the genuinely chaotic nature of early American civic administration. Small towns in the 1800s did not have professional archive systems. Records were kept informally, stored in whatever space was available, and lost through fire, flood, neglect, and simple disorganization over the following decades. This explanation is reasonable and certainly accounts for some of the missing documentation. Others point out that the specific pattern of what is missing, labor records and material invoices, rather than the broader administrative documentation of the building's commissioning and design, is too consistent to be fully explained by random archive loss. What tends to survive tells you a building was commissioned and designed. What tends to be missing tells you who built it and how. The style of these buildings adds another dimension to the question. Greek Revival, which is the dominant vocabulary of American public architecture between roughly 1820 and 1870, did not arrive gradually in American cities. It did not spread slowly from a few coastal centers to the interior over several decades as a fashion that was gradually adopted. It appeared across the continent with a speed and simultaneity that the standard narrative of style diffusion through pattern books and traveling architects, does not fully account for. Courthouses in rural Indiana with the proportions of Athenian temples. Banks in small Georgia towns with facades that belong in imperial capitals. Post offices in frontier settlements with details that require the same skills as the finest European civic architecture of the same period. All of this appearing across an enormous geographic area within a relatively compressed time window. Not everywhere at once in a single year, but spread across a span of decades that is short relative to how long it typically takes for architectural fashions to diffuse across a continent through normal cultural transmission. This raises questions about the direction and mechanism of that diffusion. Pattern books circulated, yes. Architects traveled, yes. But the physical quality of the results across locations that had very different levels of access to skilled craftsmen and architectural knowledge is more consistent than the diffusion explanation would predict. Some researchers have noted that the simultaneity and consistency of the style suggests less a fashion being adopted and more a standard being applied, as if the buildings were not being designed individually in response to a new trend, but were being produced according to a shared template, with a shared set of standards that existed independently of the local communities commissioning them. That observation is not presented as a conclusion. It is presented as a pattern that the standard diffusion explanation does not fully resolve. What would it mean if the buildings were not entirely the product of the communities whose names are attached to them? What would it mean if the skill required to produce them did not originate in the frontier settlements where they stand? These questions do not have documented answers. They are questions that sit at the edge of what the available evidence supports. The buildings are real. The skill they represent is real. The documentation gap is real. The simultaneity of the style is real. What those facts together imply beyond the standard explanation is not settled. The courthouses and civic buildings are still standing. They have been standing for over 150 years in many cases, which is itself a reflection of the quality of their construction. The archives that should contain their labor records are often empty in the specific places where the most informative documents would be. And the question of who physically carved those columns and laid those stone courses with that level of precision remains, in a surprising number of cases, genuinely unanswered, not because no one has looked, but because the records that would answer it are not there. And the buildings themselves, solid and precise and still standing, offer no explanation for their own existence beyond what can be seen on their surfaces. That is a quiet kind of gap, but it is a consistent one. And consistency, as has appeared throughout this investigation, is the detail that matters most. The buried ground floors pointed to something beneath these cities. The fires pointed to something that was lost during a specific and concentrated period. The buildings pointed to a level of craft and skill that the documented labor force does not fully account for. Each of these signs raises its own questions, but they do not appear in isolation. They appear together in the same cities, often on the same streets, within the same historical window. And now a fourth sign appears, one that is still standing, still visible, and in many cases still in use today. The train station. Railroad infrastructure in 19th century America was one of the largest and fastest expansions of transportation technology in human history. The numbers alone communicate the scale. By 1910, approximately 80,000 railroad depots and terminals were in service across the country. Between 1871 and 1900, over 170,000 miles of new track were added to the national network. To put that in context, 170,000 miles of track laid in roughly 30 years means that the equivalent of the entire circumference of the Earth was covered in rail more than 6 times over, in a single generation, across a country that was still settling large portions of its own territory. The engineering achievement represented by those numbers is genuinely remarkable and is well documented in the historical record. What is documented less clearly is the question of why so many of the buildings that served this railroad network look the way they did. Function explains a great deal about how buildings are designed. A train station needs platforms, waiting areas, ticket facilities, and connections to the track. Those functional requirements do not require vaulted ceilings. They do not require copper domes. They do not require carved stone facades, ornate ironware details, acoustic engineering of a quality that would be appropriate in a concert hall, or proportions that recall the public architecture of ancient civilizations. A simple, functional structure would serve the purpose of moving passengers through the system just as effectively. And yet simple and functional is not what was built. Grand Central Terminal in New York is always the first example offered when this subject comes up, and it is a reasonable starting point. The building's celestial ceiling, its marble concourses, its overall scale and quality of construction place it among the most architecturally significant structures in the country. But New York is a major city. A major city can justify extraordinary architecture at its primary transit hub on the basis of volume, economic significance, and civic ambition. Grand Central, for all its impressiveness, can be explained within the framework of a great city building a great gateway. The explanation is not entirely satisfying in terms of the specific quality of what was achieved, but it at least fits the scale of the city it serves. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the pattern does not stay in major cities. It appears in places where the economic and civic logic that explains Grand Central does not apply. Binghamton is a small city in upstate New York. It is not a major economic center. It was not, in 1901, a city of unusual national significance, and yet the station built there in that year was designed in the Italian Renaissance style, featuring a campanile tower of the kind that belongs in the historic center of a European city. The building is not a simplified version of a grand style. It is a full expression of it, executed with the materials and craft quality that the style requires. For a small upstate city at the turn of the century, that level of architectural investment raises questions about the logic behind the decision. San Antonio Station, completed in 1908, features an 88-foot copper dome as its central architectural element. A dome of that scale and material is not a utilitarian choice. Copper domes require skilled fabrication, significant structural support, and ongoing maintenance. They are architectural statements. They communicate something about the importance and permanence of the building. An 88-foot copper dome on a train station in a southwestern city that was still developing its regional significance in 1908 is a choice that goes well beyond what the functional purpose of the building required. At first, it seems normal to attribute this to the competitive ambitions of railroad companies. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, railroads were among the most powerful and wealthy private enterprises in the country. They competed with each other for passengers and prestige. Grand stations were part of that competition, signals of corporate power and reliability that served a marketing function alongside their practical one. A railroad that built an impressive station was communicating something to potential passengers and investors about its permanence and quality. This explanation is used regularly to account for the grandeur of railroad architecture, and it has genuine merit. However, the timeline does not fully match that explanation when the smaller stations are examined carefully. The marketing logic of impressive architecture works best when the audience for that architecture is large enough to justify the investment. A railroad building a grand terminal in New York or Chicago is reaching millions of potential passengers and projecting its image to a national audience. A railroad building a campanile tower in Binghamton or an ornate ironwork interior in a small Midwestern depot is spending comparable resources for a much smaller audience. The return on that architectural investment, in pure marketing terms, does not scale with the cost of the building. And yet the buildings were built anyway, to the same standard, with the same level of craft quality, in places where the economic logic of competitive display does not fully account for the expenditure. This raises questions about what actually drove those decisions. If marketing competition explains the grand stations in major cities, something else needs to explain the same architectural vocabulary appearing in towns too small to justify it on competitive grounds. The pattern is consistent enough that it suggests the architectural character of these buildings was not determined primarily by the economic logic of each individual location, but by something more uniform that applied across the entire network regardless of local scale. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because uniformity of this kind usually reflects either a centralized decision or a shared template. Railroad companies were large organizations capable of making centralized decisions about their infrastructure. It is possible that architectural standards were set at the corporate level and applied consistently across the network regardless of local conditions. That would explain why small-town depots share architectural vocabulary with major urban terminals. It would explain the consistency of the style across different locations, served by the same company, but does not fully explain the acoustic engineering. Multiple smaller stations built during this period feature interior acoustic properties that serve no practical purpose for a building designed to move passengers through a transit system. Vaulted ceilings that carry sound across large spaces, curved interior surfaces that distribute sound in specific ways, materials and dimensions that produce particular acoustic effects. These are not accidental characteristics. They are the result of deliberate design decisions. And in a building where the primary function is ticket purchase and train waiting, the investment in sophisticated acoustics requires an explanation that the standard framework of corporate architecture and competitive display does not provide. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Acoustic engineering is a specific technical discipline. Designing a space to behave in particular acoustic ways requires knowledge of how sound moves through different geometries and materials. It requires intentional choices about ceiling height, surface curvature, and material selection that are distinct from the choices that produce the visual architectural character of the building. A building can look grand without having sophisticated acoustics. The fact that some of these stations have both, including in locations where neither was economically necessary, suggests that the design priorities behind them extended beyond what the functional purpose of a train station requires. Whitney Warren was one of the architects who worked on Grand Central Terminal. In his writings about railroad architecture, he compared train stations to the triumphal gates of ancient cities. That comparison appears in the historical record and is typically read as the kind of elevated language that architects use to give their work cultural significance. A designer comparing his building to the gates of Rome is expressing ambition and vision, not making a literal claim. That is the standard interpretation, and it is a reasonable one. But the comparison is worth examining beyond its usual reading. The triumphal gates of ancient cities were not primarily transportation infrastructure. They were thresholds. They marked the boundary between outside and inside, between the world beyond the city and the civic space within it. They were architecturally significant because they communicated something about the city they led into. They were designed to produce a particular experience in the person passing through them, an experience of transition, of entering somewhere that had weight and permanence and cultural significance. Some believe Warren's comparison was more descriptive than metaphorical, that he was identifying something real about these buildings, that railroad stations in this period functioned as thresholds in a way that went beyond their practical role in transit. Others disagree and take the comparison at face value as architectural rhetoric. The question that sits between those positions is whether the buildings themselves, in their proportions and their acoustic properties and their craft quality, actually behave more like ancient public architecture than like 19th century transportation infrastructure. And this leads to the question that the pattern raises most directly. What if the grandeur of these buildings was not designed into them from scratch? What if the railroad companies that claimed these stations as their own infrastructure were not building from an empty site, but adapting, modifying, and incorporating structures that already existed in some form? It would explain the proportions that exceed what new construction for a transit purpose would require. It would explain the acoustic engineering that serves no function in a train station, but would serve very clear functions in a different kind of public space. It would explain why the investment in these buildings does not scale with the economic logic of the towns they served. That possibility has not been documented or confirmed. There is no established historical record of railroad companies systematically adapting pre-existing structures rather than building their own. The claim is not supported by the mainstream historical account of railroad infrastructure development, but the pattern itself, the consistent grandeur, the mismatched investment scale, the acoustic properties without practical purpose, and the architectural vocabulary that recalls public spaces from entirely different eras and functions, does not find a fully satisfying explanation in the standard account either. The stations are still there. Many of them are still in use, converted to other purposes, or still serving transit functions in reduced form. The acoustic properties that were built into them are still measurable. The proportions are still visible. And the question of why a small city in upstate New York needed a Campanile Tower on its train station in 1901 is still waiting for an answer that accounts for both the building that exists and the economic context that supposedly produced it. Those two things do not sit comfortably together. And that discomfort, quiet and specific and consistent across too many locations to be accidental, is the fourth sign pointing toward the same unresolved question. For signs have appeared so far. Each one raises questions that the standard historical explanation does not fully resolve. The buried ground floors point to a street-level change that was global in its consistency, but explained only locally. The fires point to a concentrated period of destruction, followed by architectural simplification that does not match ordinary disaster recovery. The courthouse buildings point to a level of craft skill that the documented frontier labor force does not fully account for. The train stations point to architectural investment that exceeds what the economic logic of the locations they served would justify. Each sign on its own is interesting. Together, they begin to form something more than a collection of separate puzzles. And now a fifth sign appears. This one is different from the others in one specific way. The previous signs required some searching. You had to look down at buried windows, examine old photographs, compare pre-fire and post-fire architecture, or study the proportions of buildings you had walked past without examining carefully. This fifth sign does not require any of that. It is large enough to see from a distance. It exists in almost every region of the country, and there's a reasonable probability that one of them is within 50 miles of where you are sitting right now. Between 1848 and 1890, approximately 300 enormous psychiatric institutions were constructed across the United States. Not small facilities, not modest buildings added to existing hospital grounds. Enormous complexes, sprawling structures that covered acres of land, that contained hundreds of rooms, that housed their own independent systems for water, heat, food production, and internal transportation. These were not additions to existing infrastructure. They were self-contained environments built from the ground up, placed at deliberate locations across the country, and designed according to a single standardized plan that was applied consistently regardless of which state the facility was built in or which architectural firm received the commission. The plan they followed was called the Kirkbride Plan, named after Thomas Story Kirkbride, a Philadelphia psychiatrist who developed and published the design principles behind it. Kirkbride's approach was based on the idea that the physical environment of a psychiatric institution directly affected the mental condition of its patients. Fresh air, natural light, organized space, and access to outdoor grounds were considered therapeutic elements. The architecture was meant to support recovery, not simply contain patients. This was a reform-minded approach that represented a genuine shift in thinking about mental illness and its treatment during the mid-19th century. The physical form the Kirkbride Plan produced was distinctive and consistent. A large central administration building served as the anchor of the complex. From this central structure, wings extended outward in a staggered bat wing pattern, stepping back progressively so that each wing received direct sunlight and ventilation rather than being blocked by the wing in front of it. The result was a building that, seen from above, resembled an enormous spread formation extending across the landscape. Each wing contained patient wards organized by classification. The central building contained administrative offices, staff quarters, medical facilities, and the public-facing elements of the institution. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the Kirkbride Plan was not simply an architectural diagram. The facilities built according to it were technological achievements that went well beyond their stated purpose of providing humane psychiatric care. They had their own water supply systems, often including reservoirs, pumping equipment, and distribution infrastructure that functioned independently of whatever municipal water systems existed nearby. They had their own heating and ventilation systems designed to maintain consistent interior conditions across enormous building footprints in climates that ranged from New England winters to southern summers. They had their own farms that produced food for their populations, and many of them had their own internal railroad connections, small rail systems that moved supplies and materials within the complex without requiring access to the public network. These are not the characteristics of a hospital or a care facility in the conventional sense. They are the characteristics of an independent settlement, a self-sustaining community with its own infrastructure, its own food supply, its own transportation system, and its own internal organization. The Kirkbride institutions were, by every functional measure, small cities. Not metaphorically, literally. They had populations, services, supply chains, and physical infrastructure equivalent to small urban centers. And 300 of them were built across the country within a period of roughly 40 years. At first, it seems straightforward to attribute this to the humanitarian reform movement of the mid-19th century. Mental illness was being reconsidered as a medical condition rather than a moral failure. Reformers argued that people suffering from psychiatric conditions deserved proper care in appropriate environments rather than imprisonment in ordinary jails or poorhouses, where they were frequently held. The Kirkbride Plan represented the architectural expression of this reform philosophy. State legislatures were persuaded to fund the construction of these institutions as an act of civic progress. The explanation is coherent and reflects a real historical movement with documented participants, published literature, and genuine political impact. However, the scale of what was built does not sit comfortably within the reform explanation alone. 300 facilities, each one a self-sustaining complex of significant size, each one built with craft quality that matches or exceeds the courthouses and civic buildings discussed earlier. Each one following the same standardized design regardless of local conditions, local budgets, or local architectural traditions. The uniformity alone is striking. Architectural standards varied considerably across American regions in the 19th century. Local building traditions, available materials, and regional craft knowledge all influenced how structures looked and were constructed. And yet, the Kirkbride institutions show a consistency of design and quality across regions that suggests something more centralized than individual state decisions responding to reform advocacy. The architects who worked on these buildings were not minor figures. The most prominent names in American architectural history of the period are associated with Kirkbride institutions. H. Richardson, whose work defines a significant chapter in American architectural development, designed several of them. Samuel Sloan, one of the most prolific architects of the mid-19th century, designed many more. Frederick Law Olmsted, whose landscape design work at Central Park and other major projects represents some of the most significant environmental design of the era, designed the grounds of multiple Kirkbride facilities. These were not contractors producing functional buildings on tight budgets. These were the leading design figures of their generation, applying their full capabilities to psychiatric institutions and locations that ranged from major cities to rural areas with small surrounding populations. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the involvement of the leading architects of the era, combined with the technological sophistication of the facilities themselves, combined with their geographic distribution across the entire country, combined with their consistent adherence to a single standardized plan, requires a level of coordination and resource commitment that is difficult to fully account for within the standard narrative of state-by-state reform advocacy. Each facility required significant capital investment: the land, the construction, the infrastructure systems, the ongoing operational costs of a self-sustaining complex. Multiplied by 300 facilities across 40 years, the aggregate investment is enormous, and it was sustained consistently across a period that included the Civil War, Reconstruction, and multiple economic recessions. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The Civil War consumed an extraordinary proportion of American resources between 1861 and 1865. Economic downturns in 1857 and again in the 1870s significantly constrained public spending. State legislatures during this period were managing multiple competing demands on limited budgets. And yet the construction of Kirkbride institutions continued through all of it, not slowing dramatically during the war years, not stopping during the economic contractions, continuing at a pace that produced 300 completed facilities across the full 40-year window regardless of the national conditions that were disrupting other large public investments during the same period. This raises questions about the source and consistency of the funding. State legislative appropriations for public buildings were vulnerable to the economic and political pressures of each session. Large capital projects were delayed, reduced, or canceled during difficult periods in ways that are well documented in the legislative records of the era. But the Kirkbride construction program does not show the same pattern of interruption and delay that other large public investments of the period show. Something sustained it through conditions that interrupted comparable projects. What that something was is not clearly documented in the standard historical account of the reform movement. Dorothea Dix is the figure most credited with driving the construction of these institutions. Her story is well established in American reform history. She traveled extensively through American states, documenting the conditions of mentally ill individuals in jails and poorhouses. She published her findings, testified before state legislatures, and personally advocated for the construction of proper psychiatric facilities. She is credited with directly influencing the establishment of at least 30 Kirkbride institutions and with shaping the broader political environment that made the others possible. Her work is documented, her writings survive, and her influence on 19th-century psychiatric reform is not in serious dispute. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the scale of what she is credited with influencing does not match the resources available to her as an individual operating in the social context of her time. In the mid-19th century, women in most American states could not vote, could not hold public office, and could not enter into legal contracts or own property independently. The formal political and economic structures of the period offered women almost no institutional access to the mechanisms of state funding and legislative decision-making. And yet Dix is credited with convincing state legislature after state legislature, in state after state, to authorize the expenditure of significant public funds on construction projects of enormous scale. 30 facilities that she directly influenced, each one the size of a small city, achieved through personal advocacy alone, without institutional position, without voting rights, without legal standing in most of the states she was influencing. Some believe her achievement reflects the genuine persuasive power of documented evidence presented to receptive legislators in an era when psychiatric reform was gaining cultural momentum. The right argument, made at the right moment in the right political environment, can produce results that seem disproportionate to the resources of the person making it. Others find the gap between her formal institutional standing and the scale of her attributed influence difficult to fully close through the personal advocacy explanation alone. The question is not whether she was effective. The historical record is clear that she was. The question is whether personal effectiveness, however extraordinary, fully accounts for the coordination and consistency of what was built. The Kirkbride institutions are still standing in many cases. Some have been converted to other uses. Some are abandoned. Some remain in limited operation. Their physical presence in the landscape is still visible and still measurable. The batwing layouts are still recognizable from aerial view. The infrastructure systems built into them, the water supplies, the heating systems, the internal organization of their spaces, are still present in the structures, even where the original purpose no longer functions. And the question of how a young, internally divided country found the resources and coordination to build 300 self-sustaining complexes of this quality and consistency in roughly 40 years, across conditions that disrupted comparable projects, remains more open than the standard historical account suggests. The building on the hill outside your town, or the one in the next county, or the one visible from the highway you have driven past without thinking about, is part of that pattern. It was built during the same window, to the same plan, with the same quality, and the same questions that apply to all 300 of them apply to the one nearest to you. Who coordinated this at a scale the standard explanation does not fully account for? And what exactly were these self-sustaining complexes designed to contain? Every investigation eventually reaches a point where the physical evidence stops, and the documentary record takes over. Buildings can be measured. Burial depths can be observed. Architectural quality can be assessed. Fire damage can be documented. But the people inside those buildings, the populations that filled those 300 self-sustaining complexes across the country, the individuals whose lives were recorded by the most comprehensive enumeration effort the young American government had yet attempted, those people exist in the historical record only as entries in documents. And documents, unlike buildings, can disappear completely. The census is where this investigation meets its most direct documentary problem. Not a gap in construction records. Not a missing payroll ledger from a courthouse project. A gap in the foundational population record of an entire nation at a specific and significant moment in time. The 1890 federal census was the most ambitious enumeration the United States government had conducted to that point. It counted a population of approximately 62.6 million people. It recorded not just names and ages, but detailed information about occupations, living conditions, origins, and specific population categories that no previous census had tracked with the same level of detail. It was, by the standards of its time, a comprehensive portrait of who was living in America and where and under what circumstances. That portrait is almost entirely gone, not partially damaged, not incompletely preserved due to ordinary archive deterioration, gone to a degree that is, among federal records of this scale, essentially without parallel in American history. Of the 62.6 million people enumerated in 1890, surviving records exist for approximately 6,300. That number is not a rounding. It is not a simplified figure that represents a much larger partial archive. It is the actual scale of what remains. Less than 0.01% of the people counted in 1890 can be found in the surviving records of that count. Every other federal census from 1790 through 1880 has substantial surviving records. Every federal census from 1900 onward has substantial surviving records. The 1890 census stands alone as the single complete gap in the documentary sequence. The explanation that is most commonly offered points to a fire. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington, where the 1890 census records were stored. The fire damaged a significant portion of the storage area. Water used to suppress the fire damaged additional records beyond what the flames directly reached. When the extent of the loss was assessed afterward, it was determined that roughly 75% of the 1890 population schedules had been destroyed or rendered unreadable. The fire is documented. The damage assessment is documented. The loss of records as a consequence of that fire is a matter of official record. At first, it seems like a straightforward if unfortunate case of archive loss through accidental fire. Government buildings in the early 20th century did not always have the fire suppression and storage protection systems that modern archives use. Records stored in basements were vulnerable to exactly this kind of event. The 1921 fire in this reading was a tragedy of poor storage conditions combined with an unlucky accident. The loss is real, but the cause is ordinary. This explanation is the one that most standard historical sources offer when the missing 1890 census comes up. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the 1921 fire was not the first fire to affect the 1890 census records. In March of 1896, more than 2 decades before the Commerce Department fire, a separate fire had already destroyed a specific category of 1890 census records. These were called the special schedules. The special schedules were supplementary enumeration forms that tracked specific population categories with more detail than the general population schedules. One of the most significant special schedule categories in 1890 was the enumeration of the insane, the feeble-minded, and other institutionalized populations. These were the records that specifically cataloged who was living inside the 300 Kirkbride institutions and comparable facilities across the country. The records that would have told researchers not just how many people were in those institutions, but who they were, where they came from, what they were recorded as suffering from, and what their circumstances were before institutionalization. Those records were gone by 1896, before the better-known 1921 fire, before anyone was focused on the loss of the 1890 census as a significant historical problem. The first fire removed the most specific and informative records about the institutionalized population. The second fire, 25 years later, removed the majority of what remained of the general population schedules. 2 fires, the same census, 25 years apart, each one removing a different portion of the same documentary record. This raises questions that the accidental fire explanation does not fully address. Archive fires are not unusual in the history of government record storage. Documents have been lost to fire in many countries and many periods. A single fire damaging a poorly stored archive is a straightforward, if unfortunate, event. But two separate fires affecting the same census at different times, removing different categories of records, requires either a remarkable coincidence of poor luck or something that the coincidence explanation struggles to accommodate. The probability of any specific archive being struck by two separate fire events is not negligible in a long enough time horizon, but the specificity of what was lost in each fire, first the institutional population records, then the general population schedules, gives the sequence a pattern that is difficult to attribute entirely to random misfortune. However, the timeline does not fully stop at the two fires, because after the 1921 fire, whatever had survived, the approximately 25% of population schedules that were not destroyed or rendered unreadable was placed in storage. Water-damaged volumes were set aside as partially compromised but potentially recoverable. And then, in December 1932, the Census Bureau formally recommended that the surviving water-damaged volumes be destroyed. The recommendation was reviewed and acted upon. Congress authorized the destruction. The authorization was signed on February 21, 1933. That date is where the timeline produces its most specific and difficult to dismiss detail. February 21, 1933 was the day Congress authorized the destruction of whatever remained of the 1890 census after two fires and years of storage. February 22, 1933 was the day President Herbert Hoover laid the ceremonial cornerstone for the National Archives building in Washington. The institution specifically designed and funded to permanently preserve federal records of national significance was formally inaugurated the day after Congress authorized destroying the records that would have told us who lived inside 300 self-sustaining institutional complexes during the period when the five signs in this investigation were all present simultaneously. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. One day, the destruction authorization and the preservation institution cornerstone are separated by 1 day. In isolation, the proximity could be coincidental. Government decisions are made on specific dates, and those dates, sometimes, fall near each other without meaningful connection. That is true, and it is an important qualification. Proximity in time is not the same as causal relationship. The two events on adjacent days in February 1933 are not proven to be connected by anything in the documentary record, but the sequence as a whole, two fires over 25 years targeting the same census, a formal destruction authorization for whatever survived, and the timing of that authorization 1 day before the opening of a permanent preservation institution, is a sequence that some researchers find difficult to attribute to coincidence across its full length. Each individual element can be explained separately. The 1896 fire was an accident. The 1921 fire was an accident. The destruction recommendation reflected practical decisions about damaged and unrecoverable materials. The cornerstone date was set by the schedules of political figures, with no connection to the census destruction authorization. Taken individually, each explanation is plausible. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the question is not whether each individual element can be explained separately. The question is whether the complete sequence, from the specific loss of institutional population records in 1896, through the broader loss of general population schedules in 1921, through the authorized destruction of survivors in 1933, and the timing of all of this relative to the opening of the institution designed to prevent exactly this kind of loss, adds up to something that requires more than a series of independent accidents to explain. Some researchers answer that question by pointing to what was lost and asking whether it matters. The 1890 census recorded the population of the Kirkbride institutions, along with every other category of American resident. If those records survived, researchers today would be able to examine who was inside those 300 complexes, where they came from, what brought them there, how long they stayed, whether their recorded circumstances match what the standard history of the reform movement describes as the purpose of those institutions. The loss of those records means those questions cannot be answered through direct documentary evidence. They can only be approached through the physical evidence of the buildings themselves and whatever administrative records of the institutions individually survived in state and county archives. Some believe the census loss is genuinely accidental, and that its significance is overstated by researchers looking for patterns in what is simply the ordinary messiness of historical record-keeping. Archive management in the early 20th century was inconsistent. Storage conditions were poor across many government facilities. The 1890 census was not the only record set lost during this period, only the most significant one. Others disagree and find a combination of what was lost, who had documented, and when the loss was authorized too specific to be fully accounted for by poor storage practices and bad luck. Neither position has been proven. Both remain present in the historical literature on this subject. The records themselves cannot settle the argument because the records are gone. And that is precisely the problem. The documentary evidence that would most directly address the questions raised by the 5 signs in this investigation is the evidence that no longer exists. The buildings are still standing. The burial depths are still measurable. The architectural quality is still visible. But the people, the 62.6 million individuals counted in 1890, including the populations of 300 self-sustaining institutional complexes built across the country during the same period, when the buried ground floors and the impossible fires and the unexplained buildings were all present in the same landscape. Those people exist now only as a number. 62.6 million enumerated, approximately 6,300 recoverable. The arithmetic of that loss is not ambiguous. Whatever the cause, whatever the sequence of events that produced it, the result is a gap in the American documentary record that sits precisely over the period this investigation has been examining. The physical evidence of that period is still present. The documentary evidence of who was living through it is almost entirely absent. And that combination, physical evidence without documentary confirmation, is what leaves the questions raised by all 5 signs without the kind of direct answer that would allow the investigation to close. The records are gone. The buildings remain. And the gap between what the buildings suggest and what the documents can confirm is exactly as wide today as it was on February 22, 1933, when the cornerstone of the National Archives was laid into the ground one day too late to preserve the records that might have explained what all of this was actually about. 5 signs. That is where this investigation began, and that is where it returns now. Not because the signs have been explained, but because they have been examined carefully enough that the shape of what they represent together is clearer than it was at the start. Each sign on its own raises questions. Taken together, they raise a different kind of question. Not just what caused each individual anomaly, but what kind of historical situation produces 5 separate anomalies that all point toward the same time period, appear in the same cities, and leave behind the same pattern of physical evidence, without documentary explanation. The first sign was the buried ground floors. Windows staring upward from below current street level. Original storefronts sealed beneath sidewalks in cities across the country and across different continents. Each city with its own local explanation for why its streets were raised. Drainage here, fire recovery there, flood adjustment somewhere else. Each explanation locally plausible. None of them accounting for the consistency of the result across locations that had no obvious reason to produce identical outcomes. The buried windows are still there. They have not moved. They are in the same position relative to the current street level that the old photographs showed them to be in when those photographs were taken in the late 1800s. The explanation for why they are there has not become more complete in the time since. The second sign was fire. Not isolated fires, but a pattern of catastrophic fires concentrated in the second half of the 19th century, appearing across American cities with a frequency and scale that the standard explanations of dry conditions and combustible construction do not fully account for. And within that pattern, one specific date that stands apart from all the others. October 8, 1871. 3 states. Nearly 4,000 square miles. One night, with witness accounts from at least one of those fires, describing behavior that the official explanation of wind-driven land-clearing fires has never fully absorbed. The simultaneous ignition across hundreds of miles remains, in specific technical terms, not completely explained. And the fires that preceded and followed that night, across the broader 50-year window, remain more frequent and more consistently destructive than the conditions of the era fully predict. The third sign was the buildings. The courthouses and civic structures and bank buildings that stand on the older corners of American downtowns, built between 1840 and 1890, with stonework and proportions and carved detail that raises a direct and simple question about who physically produced them. Pattern books existed. Skilled immigrants came. Architectural knowledge circulated. All of that is true and documented, and none of it fully closes the gap between the craft quality visible in these buildings and the labor force that the settlement histories of the towns containing them describe. The missing construction records compound the question. The simultaneous appearance of the same architectural vocabulary across a continent within a compressed time window adds to it. The buildings are still standing. The records of who built them are still largely absent. The fourth sign was the train stations, buildings that served a practical transportation function but were built with proportions, acoustic engineering, and craft quality that exceeded what that function required. In major cities, architectural grandeur can be justified by scale and economic significance. In small cities and towns across the Midwest and South, the same grandeur appears without the same justification. The investment does not scale with the population or economic activity of the location served. The acoustic properties serve no practical purpose for a waiting room. The comparison made by one of the era's leading architects between railroad stations and the triumphal gates of ancient cities sits in the historical record as either poetic ambition or something more descriptive than it is usually read as being. The question of what actually drove the architectural decisions behind these buildings has not been closed by the standard explanation of corporate competition and civic pride. The fifth sign was the Kirkbride institutions. 300 self-sustaining complexes built across the country in roughly 40 years, following a single standardized plan, designed by the leading architects of the era, equipped with independent infrastructure systems that made them function as small cities. Built during a period that included a civil war and multiple economic recessions, without the interruptions that comparable large public projects experienced during the same conditions, credited in significant part to a single reformer operating without the formal institutional access that the scale of her attributed influence would seem to require, and connected to the census that documented who was inside them, the census that was subsequently struck by two separate fires over 25 years, and then officially destroyed one day before the institution designed to prevent exactly that kind of loss was ceremonially opened. But this is where it becomes unclear, because listing the 5 signs in sequence produces something that is harder to dismiss than any single sign examined in isolation. Each sign individually can be assigned an explanation that is plausible enough to satisfy a casual examination. Drainage explains buried streets. Dry conditions explain fires. Pattern books explain architectural style. Corporate ambition explains grand stations. Reform advocacy explains the Kirkbride institutions. Census destruction explains the documentary gap. The explanations exist, and they are not fabricated. They represent the genuine best understanding that the standard historical framework has produced. The problem is not that the explanations are wrong. The problem is that they are individual. Each explanation addresses its own sign, in its own terms, without reference to the others. And when 5 signs appear in the same cities, in the same time period, producing the same pattern of physical evidence, without documentary confirmation, the question of whether 5 separate local explanations are sufficient becomes genuinely difficult to answer with confidence. A single unexplained anomaly in a historical record is interesting. 5 unexplained anomalies clustering around the same 50-year window and appearing in the same physical environments is something that investigators in any field would treat as a pattern requiring a pattern-level explanation, not 5 separate local ones. At first, it seems like the simplest resolution is to accept that the 19th century was simply a period of rapid, poorly documented development that produced genuine anomalies through ordinary processes operating at unusual speed and scale. A young country building itself faster than it could keep records, experiencing the ordinary disasters of industrial development at a frequency that looks unusual only in retrospect, producing architectural quality through channels that happened not to generate the documentation modern researchers would look for, losing census records through the ordinary failures of early archive management. This interpretation is coherent. It does not require anything beyond the known facts of 19th century American history, and some researchers find it fully sufficient. Others disagree, not because they have a complete alternative explanation to offer, but because the consistency of the pattern across 5 separate signs is more than this interpretation comfortably accounts for. Rapid development explains incomplete records. It does not explain why the incomplete records appear specifically around the most informative categories of information: construction labor records, institutional population records, the census schedules of institutionalized individuals. Ordinary archive loss is random in what it removes. The losses in this investigation are specific in what they target. That specificity is what some researchers find difficult to attribute entirely to the ordinary chaos of a young nation building itself quickly. However, the timeline does not fully support a definitive conclusion in either direction. The physical evidence is real, but it does not interpret itself. The buried windows are present, but they do not explain their own depth. The buildings are standing, but they do not identify their builders. The census is gone, but its absence does not confirm what it would have contained. Every piece of physical evidence in this investigation requires interpretation to become meaningful, and interpretation depends on which framework is applied. The standard framework produces one set of conclusions. A framework that takes the pattern of the 5 signs seriously as a collective phenomenon produces different questions, if not different conclusions. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the investigation reaches a boundary that the available evidence cannot cross. On one side of that boundary is what can be observed, measured, and documented: burial depths, architectural quality, fire dates, station proportions, institutional layouts, census survival rates. All of that is on the observable side. On the other side of the boundary is what those observations mean in terms of historical cause. What produced the pattern? What existed during that 50-year window that left these specific traces and not others? What the buildings were before they were what the history books say they became. That side of the boundary is where the evidence runs out and interpretation begins. And interpretation, without documentary confirmation, cannot produce conclusions that close the question. Some believe the boundary itself is informative, that the specific location of the documentary gaps, sitting precisely over the most informative categories of evidence about that 50-year window, is not accidental, that what is missing for reasons, and that the reasons are part of the answer even if the answer cannot be fully reconstructed from what remains. Others find this reasoning circular, arguing that the absence of evidence is itself evidence requires assuming that the absence is deliberate, which is the conclusion the argument is trying to reach. Without independent confirmation of deliberate removal, ordinary loss remains an equally valid explanation for the gaps. Neither side has closed the question. That is the honest position, and it is worth stating clearly. This is not an investigation that ends with a revelation. It ends with an unresolved pattern and 2 competing frameworks for interpreting it, neither of which has produced evidence sufficient to displace the other. That is an uncomfortable place to stop. Investigations are supposed to conclude. Questions are supposed to find answers. But some questions in the historical record remain genuinely open, not because researchers have not looked carefully enough, but because the evidence that would close them is no longer present. The courthouse in your town is still standing. If it was built between 1840 and 1890, it has the stonework. It has the proportions. It probably does not have complete construction records in the local historical society archive. The train station, if your town has one from that era, has the vaulted ceiling or the ornate ironwork or the acoustic properties that serve no practical purpose for a waiting room. The Kirkbride institution within 50 miles of where you are has the batwing layout still visible in its physical structure, still readable in aerial photographs, still present in the landscape, whether it is operating or abandoned or converted to some other use. These things are all still there. They were there before this investigation began, and they will be there after it ends. The buried windows are still facing downward beneath the sidewalk grates of older downtown streets. The photographs that first raised these questions are still in the local history archives, available to anyone who asks to see them. The gap in the census record is still exactly the size it was when the last surviving volumes were authorized for destruction in February 1933. What happened during that 50-year window between 1850 and 1900 produced physical evidence that is durable enough to still be present and still be measurable more than a century later. What it did not reliably produce is the documentary record that would explain what the physical evidence means. And that gap between what the structures suggest and what the records confirm is the territory where this investigation lives. Not on the side of the answer, on the side of the question, where it has always been, and where, for the moment, it remains. The buildings remember something. The question is whether the rest of the record is complete enough to remember it with them. So far, the answer to that question is not clearly yes, and that uncertainty, quiet and specific, and sitting in the ground beneath the streets of towns across the country, is where this investigation stops. Not because the question has been answered, but because the evidence, for now, will not go further.